The numbers arrived the way most important things arrived in Harlan County. Not all at once, not with any announcement, but in pieces through the ordinary channels of a small community that had long since learned to carry information the way water carries silt, slowly and without intention. By November of 2000, most people in Cutter's Creek knew that the orchard on Route 9 was supplying grocery stores and co-ops across 3 counties. They knew the name on the account, they knew the apple variety. What they did not know, and what would not be fully understood until much later, was what it had actually taken to get from a dead orchard and $300 to that particular outcome. That story had been happening quietly in the mornings without witnesses for 11 years. This is where it started, April 14th, 1989. The sign had been nailed to the fence post for 11 days before anyone stopped long enough to read all of it. Most people slowed down, squinted from their truck windows, read the first 4 words "orchard for sale," and drove on. The orchard belonged to Gerald Marsh, had belonged to his father before him, and to his grandfather before that. 3 generations of Marshmen had grown apples and pears on that hillside plot outside Cutter's Creek, and 3 generations had slowly, quietly exhausted every last thing the land had to give. The irrigation lines ran shallow and crooked, half of them cracked through the middle from 2 decades of hard winters. The soil had been pushed past its limit with chemical fertilizers through the 1970s, and now it sat pale and dense, barely capable of holding moisture after a rain. The trees themselves, 64 of them across 4 acres, stood with their bark splitting their canopy, thin and brittle, producing fruit so small and bitter by 1988 that Gerald couldn't give it away at the church sale. He was asking $300 for all 4 acres, the trees, the broken irrigation, the exhausted soil, the rusted hand tools in the shed at the back of the property. $300, and he couldn't find a single taker. Douglas Hart from the county agricultural office stopped by on a Tuesday in late March and told Gerald plainly that the land was, in his professional estimation, non-viable. He said the root systems on trees that far gone couldn't be recovered without investment that would dwarf any possible return. He said the topsoil layer was too thin and too depleted for replanting without commercial soil amendment programs that cost more per acre than the land itself was worth. He shook Gerald's hand, left his card, and told him the county might be able to help him file for an agricultural loss designation that would reduce his tax burden. Gerald thanked him and watched him drive away. 2 men from a property development firm out of Lexington came out the first week of April. They walked the 4 acres together in their clean boots, talked quietly between themselves, and made Gerald an offer of $220 less than his asking price, contingent on him clearing the trees himself before transfer. Gerald told them he'd think about it. They never called back. By April 14th, Gerald Marsh was tired. He was 61 years old. His back had been bad since 1983, and he had a daughter in Corbin who needed help with her rent. He dropped the price to 300 flat trees in all and told his neighbor Clarence Webb at the feed store that he'd take the first 300 anyone put in his hand, no questions, no conditions. Clarence told 3 people. Those 3 people told 7 more. That was when Boyd Marsh came home from Lexington. Boyd was 34, Gerald's son, a sales manager for a food distribution company who thought in margins and quarterly projections and had never fully understood why his father treated the land the way other men treated family photographs. He drove up on a Thursday evening, let himself in through the kitchen door, and stood across the table from his father with the particular posture of a man who has already decided he is right. "You're not selling at 300, Boyd said. I already made calls. A timber outfit will pay 800 for just the trees. The cleared land to those Lexington people, that's another 500 minimum. $1,300, Dad. not 3. Gerald was quiet for a moment. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. The wood in those trees belonged to your grandfather, he said. Granddad has been dead for 22 years. The wood is still here and it has a price. It has a different kind of price than the one you're talking about. Boyd pulled out a chair and sat down. He was not a cruel man, he was a practical one, and in his experience, practicality and sentiment occupied different rooms that did not connect. You're letting emotion drive a financial decision, he said. That's exactly the kind of thinking that let this place get to where it is. Gerald set his cup down. He stood up, walked to the back door, and went outside. The conversation was over in the way that conversations with Gerald Marsh were sometimes over, not with a door slam or raised voice, but with an absence that was complete. Boyd stayed in Cutter's Creek for a week. He spoke to neighbors. He went to Clarence Webb's feed store and told Clarence that selling at $300 was irresponsible, that it would set a precedent for distressed property values in the area. Clarence listened politely and forgot it immediately because he had feed invoices to reconcile and a delivery coming Thursday. Boyd failed to prevent the sale, but his presence added a layer to the community's understanding of the Marsh Orchard that lingered. This was not only a dead piece of land, it was a piece of land that had caused a family to argue. That made it feel more weighted and more permanently finished than it had before. Weston Cobb was 64 years old that spring, and he had farmed the same 80 acres 3 miles east of Cutter's Creek since 1961. He grew corn and hay, primarily kept a small kitchen garden behind his house, and maintained every piece of equipment he owned with a patience and precision that people in the county had long since stopped trying to understand. His tractor was a 1954 Farmall M that he had rebuilt twice with his own hands. His truck was a 1971 Ford F-100 with rust along the wheel wells and an engine that ran clean because Weston looked after it the way he looked after everything without waiting to be reminded. People in Harlan County respected Weston Cobb in the way a community sometimes respects someone they have quietly decided not to listen to. He was known for being right about weather. He was known for never losing a crop to disease in 28 years. He was known for saying very little and meaning everything he said. But he was also 64, drove an old truck, and had no interest in the kind of modern, large-scale operation that the younger farmers in the county were building through the 1980s, with equipment loans and chemical programs and yield maximization consultants from the state university. He had learned most of what he knew about soil from a woman named Margaret Owens, who had farmed 40 acres alone from 1946 to 1971 on the far side of Clover Ridge, after her husband died of a stroke 6 weeks after the war ended. Weston was 28 when he first met her, still young enough to listen to anyone who seemed to know something. She had handed him a jar of her own soil once and told him to hold it with his eyes closed. She said the soil would tell you what it needed if you were quiet enough to listen. She said most farmers talk too much and touch the ground too little. She said the ones who went broke fastest were always the ones who put inputs in and expected outputs out without ever asking what the ground itself was trying to do. Weston had listened. He kept listening for 30 years after Margaret was gone in the particular way that knowledge becomes part of a person's daily practice rather than something they can point to and explain. He had driven past the Marsh Orchard a dozen times over the years. He knew its history the way he knew most things in the county, quietly without making a point of it. He had watched it decline through the late 1970s. He had noticed the color of the leaves each August, the way they turned early, and thin, the way the fruit sat small on branches that should have been heavy. He had his own thoughts about why. He kept them to himself because nobody had asked. He parked his F-100 on the gravel shoulder of Route 9 on that Saturday morning and climbed out slowly and stood at the fence for a long time. He did not walk the property immediately. He stood at the fence and looked at it the way a man looks at something he is calculating, not admiring. He looked at the angle of the slope. He looked at where the water would run after a hard rain. He looked at which trees were worst along the low end of the property where the drainage had always been poor. He crouched near the fence post and picked up a handful of soil and held it for a moment, feeling the texture of it, then set it back down carefully. Gerald Marsh came out of his house when he saw the truck. They shook hands at the fence. Gerald explained unnecessarily that the orchard was in rough shape. Weston nodded. Gerald said the irrigation was mostly broken. Weston nodded again. Gerald said Douglas Hart from the county office had told him the soil was non-viable and the trees were too far gone to recover without serious investment. Weston looked at the trees for a moment after that, and then he looked at Gerald. "I'll give you $300 for it," Weston said. Gerald blinked. "You understand what you're looking at." "I do," Weston said. Gerald took the $300 in cash that afternoon. That evening, Weston came home and washed his hands at the kitchen sink, and then he sat down at the table, and his wife Nadine looked at him from across the room. Nadine Cobb was 61 years old, the daughter of a tobacco farmer from Bell County, a woman who had spent 34 years learning which of her husband's silences meant he was thinking, and which meant he had already decided. She was not a nervous woman, and she was not a sentimental one. She was practical in the way that people who grow up farming are practical, with a clear-eyed understanding that the land gives and takes according to its own schedule, and that the best you can do is pay attention. She had seen the look on his face when he came through the door. She recognized it. "You bought the Marsh orchard," she said. It was not a question. $300. Nadine set down the dish towel. She turned fully to face him. "Douglas Hart wrote in a county document that the land can't be recovered," she said. Douglas Hart was reading what the land looks like. That's not the same as reading what it needs. "Weston," she sat down across from him. "We have 80 acres. You're 64 years old. Your back." "I know my back." She looked at her husband for a long moment. 34 years of marriage had given her a reliable index to the expressions on his face. This one, the particular stillness of it, the quality of certainty that did not require anyone else's agreement, she had seen before. It had been right more times than she could count. That did not mean it could not eventually be wrong. "How much more money?" she said, "beyond the 300. "Not much each year. Seed stock, aluminum pipe, I won't hire help." "How long?" He did not answer immediately. She noticed this. He was usually quick when he was certain. This time he sat with the question the way he sat with soil samples, turning it over. 10 years, he said, maybe 12. Nadine looked at her husband across the kitchen table. She made a decision that she would not explain to him because he did not need an explanation. He needed something different. "I want to know what's happening while it's happening," she said. "Not when it's finished. Good or bad, I want to know." "All right." "Promise me." He looked at her. "I promise." Nadine stood up and went back to the sink. The conversation was finished, or rather, it had shifted into the longer form it would take over the next decade, the one that would be conducted in Friday evening reports and small questions in a private notebook. She started that same night on the first blank page she could find. April 14th, 1989. "Weston bought the Marsh orchard today. $300. 10 years, maybe 12. I don't know if he's right, but I know him." The story traveled through Cutter's Creek the way stories always did through the co-op on Monday morning, through the feed store by Tuesday noon, through the diner on Wednesday, and through the church parking lot by Sunday. By the end of that first week, there was not a farmer or shopkeeper or county official in the area who had not heard that Weston Cobb had paid $300 for the dead Marsh orchard. The laughter was not mean. The people of Cutter's Creek were not a cruel community. They were practical people, and practically speaking, what Weston had done made no sense at all. And when something makes no sense, even decent people laugh. Douglas Hart heard the news at the county office and shook his head slowly. He had written his assessment in plain language. He could not imagine what Weston Cobb thought he was going to do with 4 acres of dead trees and exhausted soil, and he said so to the 2 people in the office who asked him about it. Franklin Dillard, who ran the largest apple operation in the county on 140 acres south of town, heard the story out of the co-op and laughed outright. Franklin was 41, had taken over his father's farm in 1979, and had spent the decade since expanding aggressively with new dwarf rootstock plantings, drip irrigation systems, and a commercial cold storage facility. He knew orchards. He knew what a depleted orchard looked like, and he knew what it cost to fix one. He told 2 other farmers at the co-op that Weston Cobb had always been a little peculiar, and that peculiarity had apparently sharpened with age. Nadine heard it at the grocery store from a woman who did not know she was Weston's wife. That Cobb man bought the dead marsh place for $300. You hear that? My husband says he's always been a little off. Nadine collected her groceries, paid, walked to the truck, and sat in the driver's seat for a minute before starting the engine. That evening, she wrote in her notebook, "People are laughing. I'm not laughing, I'm also not certain." Weston heard some of it. He heard enough through the normal channels of a small community to have no doubt about what people were saying. He made no response. He did not explain himself at the feed store. He did not defend his purchase at the co-op. He bought what he needed, nodded when spoken to, and drove back out to his farm. Within a week of the purchase, he began. The first thing Weston did was nothing that anyone watching would have called farming. He spent the first 3 weeks of May simply studying. He walked the 4 acres every morning before the heat came in, moving slowly through the rows of trees, kneeling in the soil, pressing his fingers into the ground at different points across the property. He brought a mason jar on the 3rd day and filled it with soil from 4 different locations: the high end near the fence, the middle of the 2nd row, the low corner where the drainage sat worst, and the flat section near the shed. He took the jar home and spent 2 evenings looking at it in different lights, rubbing samples between his fingers, smelling it. What the soil told him was this: it was not dead. It was starved. There was a difference, and the difference was everything. In late May of 1989, he planted crimson clover and winter rye between every row of trees on the entire 4 acres, not for harvest, not for sale, simply to begin the work of returning nitrogen to the soil, of loosening the compacted layers, of giving the microorganisms in the ground something to work with again. He seeded it by hand, walking each row slowly with a canvas bag over his shoulder. In June, he turned to the irrigation. The system Gerald Marsh had used was a surface-run gravity line from a catchment tank at the top of the property, fed by a spring that still ran clean and cold from the ridge above. The lines themselves were the problem: old aluminum pipe crimped and cracked in a dozen places, poorly sloped, pooling in the low sections and running dry in the high ones. Weston pulled every section of line by hand over 3 weeks, working in the mornings before the heat. He relayed the lines himself, resloping them along new grades he had calculated by eye during those first weeks of walking the property. He replaced the cracked sections with new aluminum he bought in 10-foot lengths from the hardware store in town, soldering the joints himself with a propane torch in the shed at the back of the property. Nobody came to watch. Nobody asked how it was going. The cover crops grew green and thick between the gray rows of trees, and Weston worked in the mornings and the summer passed. In the fall of 1989, Weston began work on the trees themselves. He started with 12, the ones on the upper section of the property where the drainage was best and the soil had degraded least. He spent October studying their branch structure, tracing the lines of healthy wood from the base upward identifying which branches still carried viable cambium beneath their cracked bark. He grafted through October and November, working in the cold mornings with a grafting knife he had sharpened to a precise edge on a whetstone he had owned since 1958. He cut scions from a healthy apple tree on his own property, the variety his father had planted in 1939 that had never once failed him, which the family had always called simply the Cobb Red. It produced a medium-sized apple with dense flesh and a sharp, complex flavor that stored exceptionally well without refrigeration and ripened in stages through September and October, rather than all at once, which spread the harvest window and reduced spoilage. He wrapped each graft in budding rubber and moved to the next one. By the end of November, he had grafted 31 trees. He covered the remaining 33 through the winter with a program of deep mulching, applying 6 inches of wood chip mulch around each base to hold soil temperature, reduce moisture loss, and begin the slow work of adding organic matter back into the depleted topsoil layer. Every Friday evening that fall, Weston sat down at the kitchen table and told Nadine what had happened at the orchard that week. He had made her a promise in April, and he kept it the way he kept everything, without drama, without omission. He described which trees had shown the most viable wood. He described the quality of the soil where he had placed the new mulch. He described the spring at the top of the ridge and the sound it made in November when the flows slowed with the cold. Nadine listened. Sometimes she asked questions. Sometimes she only nodded. After each of these Friday evenings, she wrote in her notebook. In the spring of 1990, Douglas Hart drove out to Route 9 and saw Weston moving through the rows with his small notebook. He pulled over and walked through the fence. "Weston, I want to be straight with you." Weston looked up and waited. "I wrote that assessment to protect farmers from putting money into ground that the science says can't come back. I stand behind what I wrote." "What science did you use?" Weston asked. Not hostile, genuinely curious. Douglas listed the standard nutrient panel tests: nitrogen, phosphorus, pH levels. "Those panels measure what's present," Weston said. "They don't measure what's alive. Do you know how many organisms are still active in this soil?" Douglas did not have an answer for that. Not because he was uninformed, but because the question had never been part of the county's assessment methodology. It was not a question the forms asked. "I'm not going to argue with you," Weston said. "You were reading what this land looks like. I'm trying to read what it needs. Those are two different kinds of reading." Douglas drove away, unsettled in a way he could not precisely name. That evening, he told his wife Norma what had happened. She was a high school English teacher, and she had spent 30 years asking people to say exactly what they meant. "What's bothering you about it?" she asked. He thought about it for a while. "He wasn't defensive," Douglas said. "He answered me like my objection was reasonable but didn't apply." Norma considered this. Maybe that's because it was. December of 1990 brought a cold snap that set records for Harlan County, temperatures below zero for 2 weeks in succession. Weston drove out to the orchard every morning to check. On the 3rd week, he found that 2 of the 31 grafted trees were showing signs of failure. The bark at the graft union had darkened and puckered. He scraped a small section with his thumbnail. The cambium beneath had gone pale brown instead of green. Those 2 trees would not survive the winter. He made the notation in his notebook. His hand was steady when he wrote. But in the truck on the drive home, he pulled over once on Route 9, turned off the engine, and sat in silence for a period he didn't count. He knew the 62 remaining trees still needed what they needed. He knew the work did not change because 2 trees had failed. But knowing what the work required and feeling ready to return to it were not always the same thing, and for those 20 minutes in the cold truck on Route 9, they were in different places. He started the engine and drove home. That Friday evening, he told Nadine, "Lost 2 trees. The cambium died in the cold snap." She set down her book. How many are left? 62. She looked at him at the particular quality of weight in his face that she had not seen before this moment. Not doubt, something more honest than doubt. The weight of the distance between understanding a thing and living through it. 62 trees still need what they need, she said. Yes. Do you want to stop? He paused before he answered. No, but tonight I understand why other people would. Nadine picked up her book again. She did not say anything further, but she did not sleep until well past 2 in the morning, and when she wrote in her notebook later that night, she wrote December 1990. He lost 2 trees. He's not stopping. But tonight I saw the weight of it on him for the first time. I decided that was honest, not alarming. In the spring of 1992, 3 years after the purchase, 8 of the 12 grafted trees in the upper section put out new growth that was visibly different from anything the orchard had shown in years. The leaves came in wide and dark green, the color of genuine health carried on new branches that had grown 6 to 8 inches from the graft unions in the prior season. Weston stood among them on a morning in late April and looked at each one carefully and allowed himself one small nod before moving on to the next row. He said nothing to anyone in town. On a morning in early May, Nadine drove out to Route 9 without telling him she was coming. She left the truck on the shoulder and walked into the orchard. Weston was working in the 3rd row and did not see her at first. She stood at the 1st row and looked at the new growth, the breadth of those leaves, the particular darkness of their green, the way the new branches carried themselves with a straightness that spoke of something working right at the root. She looked at the soil between the rows, darker than she had expected, crumbling, where last season's cover crop had been turned in the irrigation lines running true along the slope. She stood there for a while. She was not waiting to be convinced. She needed to see which was different. When Weston looked up and found her standing there, he stopped what he was doing. "Do you need anything?" she said. "No, but thank you for coming." She stood with him for 20 minutes, not speaking, watching him work. Then she drove home and wrote in her notebook, May 1992. "I went to the orchard today. I saw it. He was right. I'm not going to tell him I wrote this because he doesn't need to hear it from me. He already knows. But I needed to write it down." The years from 1992 through 1995 were the years of confirmation that no one outside the orchard was yet paying attention. Weston expanded his cover crop rotation, adding hairy vetch and buckwheat, turning both back into the soil at the end of each summer as green manure. He planted comfrey along the fence lines. He added a second catchment tank at the midpoint of the property. He grafted the remaining 33 trees through 1993 and 1994, completing the renovation of all 64 by the end of the 4th year. In the spring of 1993, he found earthworms in the upper sections for the first time. He noted this in his small notebook, and it meant more to him than any yield figure could have. In the fall of 1994, the 12 oldest grafted trees produced their first meaningful crop, 40 to 50 pounds per tree. Weston picked it himself, packed it into wooden crates, and sold it at the Cutters Creek Farmers Market on 3 consecutive Saturdays in October. It sold out each time before noon. When people asked where the apples came from, he told them the orchard on Route 9. Most of them had forgotten there was an orchard on Route 9. That same October, at the second Saturday market, Boyd Marsh came through. He was in town visiting his father and had no particular intention of stopping at the market. He passed the stall, saw the hand-lettered sign, Cobb Orchard, Route 9, and stopped walking. He picked up an apple and bit into it. He chewed slowly. Then he found Weston at the back of the stall. "Where'd the rootstock come from?" he asked. "The original trees under the grafts." "Your grandfather's trees are still there," Weston said. "I grafted onto the existing root systems. The roots are marsh. The variety is Cobb." Boyd stood with that for a moment. He bought 1 pound of apples, paid exact change, and left without saying anything else. He did not say thank you. He did not say he was wrong. But he also, for the first time in 6 years of intermittent disagreement, did not say anything further against it. In 1995, a woman named Vera Dillard Franklin, Dillard's wife, bought a bag of Cobb red apples at the farmer's market after a friend mentioned them. She brought them home and set them on the kitchen table. Franklin saw them at dinner. Where do those come from? The Cobb Orchard, Route 9. He looked at the apples. The Marsh Place. They go by Cobb now. Vera bit into one. They're better than ours. Franklin set his fork down. You're telling me a 4-acre operation on dead ground is producing better fruit than 140 acres with professional management. I'm telling you to taste one. He did not taste one. He picked up his plate and took it to the sink, and the conversation ended in the way Franklin ended conversations he did not want to continue, by removing himself from the room. Vera continued buying Cobb red apples every fall. She did not bring them up with Franklin again, but she remembered the conversation, and she kept the memory. The way you keep something you understand will matter later. In 1996, Weston added 2 beehives at the northeast corner of the orchard. He did not keep bees commercially. He kept them because the orchard needed them, and because nothing in agriculture operates in isolation, and because every problem with a crop is eventually a question about the whole system surrounding it. By 1997, all 64 trees were in genuine, reliable production. Weston harvested just over 4,000 pounds of apples that fall. He sold them at the farmer's market and to 2 small grocers in town. He began a second notebook that year, recording yields by tree, by row, and by week of harvest. Franklin Dillard heard through the feed store that Weston was selling apples from the old Marsh Place. He heard it twice from 2 different people, and each time he noted it without much reaction. 4,000 pounds was nothing. His operation was moving 60,000 pounds in a good year. In the fall of 1997, Boyd Marsh returned to the farmer's market on a Saturday in October. He stood at the Cobb stall again and looked at the bins of apples. The root systems, he said to Weston, are they holding better every year? Boyd nodded slowly. He bought 2 pounds this time. He paid and left. He had come back and he had asked about the roots. That was a different kind of question than the ones he had asked in 1989. By the fall of 1999, the 10th year, Weston Cobb had harvested 11,300 pounds of apples from the 4-acre orchard on Route 9. He recorded the figure in the second notebook on a Wednesday evening in mid-October, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp on and his reading glasses low on his nose. He wrote the number the same way he wrote everything small, precise, without flourish. Then he turned to the page where he tracked his grocery accounts and wrote 4 new names beneath the 2 he already had. Nadine was reading in the chair by the window. She did not ask what he was writing. After 10 years of Friday evenings, she could read the quality of his silence well enough to know when the news was good. He told her the figure when he set the notebook down. She looked up from her book. She held the number for a moment, the way you hold something you want to feel the full weight of before you set it down. 11,000, she said. 11,300. She nodded once slowly and returned to her page. But he saw her hand move just slightly, just enough, and he knew she was going to write it down later. She had been writing things down for 10 years in the small notebook she kept in the drawer beside her side of the bed, the one she had never shown him, and he had never asked to see. He had known about it since 1991, when he came home late from the orchard one November evening and found her writing in it at the kitchen table, and she had closed it without explanation, and he had said nothing because some things between people who have been married a long time do not require words to be understood. He leased the 2-acre parcel north of the orchard that January, $40 a month, from a retired couple named Whitfield, who had stopped farming it 3 years earlier, and were glad to have someone using the land again. He began the soil work on the new parcel immediately, the same rotation he had used on the original 4 acres, the same unhurried timeline. There was nothing to explain about this. He had learned what the work required, and the work on the new parcel required the same thing the original work had required: time and the willingness to wait for it. It was April of 2000 when Douglas Hart called. Weston was in the equipment shed when the phone rang in the house, and Nadine answered it and came to the shed door and said Douglas Hart wanted to know if he could come by the orchard sometime that week. Weston set down the wrench he was holding. Tell him Thursday morning. He did not think much about it between the call and the visit. He had learned over 64 years and then some that spending time anticipating conversations was a reliable way to have the wrong conversation when the moment came. Douglas arrived on Thursday at 8 in the morning driving a blue Buick that was newer than anything Weston had ever owned. He was 62 now, retired from the county agricultural office since 1997, and he looked like a man who had adjusted to retirement the way some men adjust to a smaller pair of shoes, functioning, but aware at every step of the constraint. They walked the orchard together. This was different from Douglas's visit in 1990, when he had come to the fence with his assessment already written and his position already fixed. This time he walked slowly, stopped where Weston stopped, looked where Weston pointed. He crouched at the second row and pressed his palm flat against the soil. He stayed in that position longer than Weston expected. The color, Douglas said, takes 4 or 5 years to shift that far, longer in the low sections. Douglas stood. He looked down the row at the trees, their branch structure wide and clean, the canopy dense in the way that only comes from root systems that have been given exactly what they need for exactly as long as they needed it. I wrote that assessment in plain language, Douglas said. He was not looking at Weston when he said it. He was still looking at the trees. Non-viable. I said it to Gerald Marsh's face, and I wrote it in a county document. Weston waited. Douglas turned. I was wrong. I want you to know that I understand that. You were doing what the job asked for, Weston said. You were looking at what most men would do with a piece of ground in this condition. Most men would have lost their investment, but you're not most men. I knew this specific piece of ground, Weston said. That's all the difference there was. Douglas nodded. He looked out over the 4 acres, the restored irrigation lines running true. Along the grade, the soil dark and open between the rows, the trees standing full against the April sky. He had spent 30 years as a county agricultural officer reading land. He had been wrong about this particular piece of land in a way that he had since come to understand was not simply a factual error but a failure of category. He had applied the right tool to the wrong problem, and the distance between those two things had turned out to be large. He stayed 40 minutes. He asked about the grafting timeline, about the cover crop rotations, about the irrigation redesign. Weston answered each question with the same direct precision he brought to everything describing the work. Without ornament, the way a craftsman describes a job well done, not with pride exactly, but with the quiet authority of someone who knows every step of what they built and why each step mattered. When Douglas left, Weston stood in the equipment yard and watched the blue Buick back out onto the road. He felt nothing complicated about the visit. Douglas Hart had been wrong 11 years ago and had come to say so. That was a decent thing to do, and Weston respected it. But the orchard had not needed Douglas Hart's acknowledgement to become what it had become. It had simply needed the work. That evening, Douglas sat at the kitchen table with his wife Norma across from him. Norma was 53, a high school English teacher who had spent 30 years asking students to say precisely what they meant and mean precisely what they said. She did not offer comfort as a first response. She offered attention, which was Douglas had come to understand over 28 years of marriage, the rarer and more valuable of the two. I went out to the Cobb orchard today, he said. I know, you told me this morning. I told him I was wrong. What did he say? He said I was doing what the Jeb asked for, that I was looking at what most men would have done with the land. Douglas paused. It was generous. It was also accurate, Norma said. Both things can be true at once. What's sitting with you then? Douglas looked at his hands on the table. Gerald Marsh was exhausted when he sold. He would have sold at 300 regardless of what I told him. I've been telling myself that for 11 years. Maybe it's true. Maybe. But I don't actually know that it's true. I know it might be true. There's a distance between those two things that I haven't been willing to sit in. Norma was quiet for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the April evening was still and blue. That's the most honest thing I've heard you say about this, she said finally. I know. The distance doesn't go away just because you named it. I know that too. But naming it is where you start. Douglas looked at his wife for a long moment. In 28 years, she had never told him what he wanted to hear, when what he needed to hear was something harder. He had not always been grateful for this in the moment. He was always grateful for it later. The figure 3 counties reached Franklin Dillard the way most things reached him, through a transaction. A buyer he worked with regularly, a man named Osborne out of Lexington, who moved regional produce to independent grocers across eastern Kentucky, called him in November about increasing his volume for the following season. Near the end of the call, Osborne mentioned almost in passing that he was working with a smaller operation up in Cutter's Creek, whose apple variety had developed a very consistent repeat purchase pattern among retailers. Franklin asked the name. Osborne said Cobb Orchard Route 9. Franklin was quiet long enough that Osborne asked if he was still there. I'm here, Franklin said. I know the operation. He did not say anything more about it. He finished the call, set the phone down on his desk, and sat for a while looking out the window at his own orchard, 140 acres of managed trees in the gray November light, dormant and correct. Then he called Vera. She answered on the second ring. He could hear the television in the background. You know the Cobb Orchard on Route 9, he said without preamble. A pause. I've been buying their apples for 5 years, Franklin. I know. Another pause longer. You called to tell me you know. I called because I want to go out there and talk to Weston Cobb about his grafting program, about his soil work, and I wanted to know before I called him whether you thought I was going to the right person. He stopped. I know that's a strange thing to ask. Vera was quiet for a moment. He could hear the television go silent. She had turned it off. You're going to the right person, she said. You've been going to the wrong person about that orchard since 1989. He did not answer immediately. I should have listened in 95, he said, the night with the apple. You weren't ready to listen in 95. That's not an excuse. I didn't say it was. I said it was true. Her voice was even, not sharp. Go talk to him, Franklin. It's 11 years late, and it's still worth doing. He called Weston that evening. Weston answered on the third ring, and Franklin explained who he was, which was unnecessary, but which felt necessary, and said he had been hearing things about the orchard and would like to come out and talk if Weston was willing. There was a pause on the line. Saturday morning, Weston said. Come to the farm, not the orchard. I'll show you the stock trees. Franklin came on Saturday. They walked the original Cobb property together in the early morning. The same 80 acres Weston had worked since 1961. The same equipment shed with the farmall, inside in the clean smell of oil and order that came from a man who looked after everything he owned without waiting to be reminded. Weston took him to the old Cobb red tree at the north edge of the property. 61 years old, planted by Weston's father in 1939, still carrying fruit with a density and regularity that Franklin, who had managed commercial orchards for 20 years, had rarely seen in trees half its age. The bark was deeply furrowed but sound. The branch structure was wide and layered in the particular way that only happens when a tree has never been pushed past what it was ready to give. Franklin stood and looked at it for a while. "This is where the grafts came from," Weston said. "All of them. All 64. Franklin walked around the tree slowly, looking at the root flare, the soil condition immediately beneath the drip line, dark and open with the faint, sweet smell of active biological life. He did not say anything for a while. "My soil panels come back clean every year," Franklin said finally. "Nitrogen, phosphorus, pH. My agronomist has never flagged anything." "Those panels measure what's present," Weston said. "They don't measure what's alive." Franklin looked at him. "There's a difference," Weston said simply, and left it at that. They walked back toward the equipment shed. Weston answered every question Franklin asked about the rotation timing, about the grafting technique, about the irrigation redesign, about the years when the results were still invisible, and the work had to continue on the basis of understanding alone without confirmation. He described each phase of the 11-year restoration the way he described everything, with a precision that was not performance, but simply the natural language of a man who had paid close attention to every step of what he had done and why. Franklin listened the way a man listens when he has finally stopped deciding in advance what he is about to hear. Before Franklin left, he stopped at his truck. He stood with his hand on the door for a moment, not looking at Weston. "I said things at the co-op in '89, he said, about you buying that land, about your judgment." He paused. "I was wrong about it, about all of it. I want you to know I understand that." Weston looked at him steadily. "You were working with what you knew," he said. "Most men are. The question is whether you keep working with only that or whether you let what you don't know become part of the picture." Franklin nodded. He shook Weston's hand and got in the truck. Driving home, he called Vera again. "I talked to him," he said. "How was it?" "He answered every question. Didn't make me feel like a fool for being 11 years late to ask them." "No," Vera said. "I didn't think he would." Franklin drove in silence for a moment. "I owe you an apology for '95. Franklin." I picked up the apple and walked away from the table. That was the wrong thing to do. Vera was quiet for a beat. "Order the soil test first, then we can talk about '95. You're not going to make this easy." "No," she said, "but I'm on the phone with you at 8 in the morning on a Saturday, so I think you know where I stand." He did. That winter, Franklin Dillard ordered a full biological soil test on his 140 acres. The first comprehensive assessment he had ever run that went beyond the standard nutrient panels his agronomist used annually. The results took 3 weeks. He read them at the kitchen table on a January evening, Vera across from him with her own reading, and when he set the report down, she looked up. "Bad," she said. "Not bad, just incomplete." He looked at the pages. "The chemistry is fine. The biology is thin." She waited. 11 years, he said. He built the biology in 11 years, starting from nothing. Vera set her book down. She looked at her husband, this man who had laughed at the co-op in 1989, who had put his fork down at the kitchen table in 1995, who had called her on a Saturday morning in November with something close to humility in his voice, asking whether he was going to the right person. "Are you going to do it?" she said. "The rotation program. I called the agronomist already. He's coming out in February." Franklin paused. He's never heard me ask about cover crops before. "What did you tell him?" Franklin looked out the kitchen window at his own orchard in the January dark. "I told him I drove past the Cobb place." Vera picked up her book again, but she was smiling a small, private smile that Franklin noticed and did not remark on, because some things between people who have learned each other well do not require remarking. The October Saturday in 2001 brought 43 farmers to the orchard on Route 9. Weston had agreed to walk them through it and answer questions. He had not agreed to give a speech, and he did not give one. He walked the 4 acres with the group the way he walked them alone, unhurried, pausing where there was something worth pausing for, explaining what had been done, and why in the same plain language he had always used. He brought the first notebook, one that started in April of 1989, and showed the early pages, the soil observations written in his small, careful hand, the graft records, the irrigation notes. He held it open and passed it down the line so people could see the actual entries, the actual handwriting, the actual dates. Near the end of the walk, a young farmer from Knox County came up beside him between the rows. He was 26 with the look of someone who had driven a long way skeptical and was now recalculating. His name was Calvin Reed, and he had 3 years into his first orchard and a head full of university extension recommendations that had been teaching him to think in terms of yield and efficiency and seasonal output. "Can I ask you something?" Calvin said. Weston nodded. "When did you know it was going to work?" Weston considered the question. He did not answer quickly, which Calvin later thought was the most instructive thing about the exchange, not the answer itself, but the fact that the question was treated as something that deserved genuine thought. "I didn't know," Weston said. "Not the way you mean." "What way do I mean?" "The way where you can say on this date, I became certain." Weston paused. "I knew the work that was needed, the rest was application. You apply what you know, you watch what happens, you adjust. You don't get certainty. You get accumulating evidence, and you decide how much of it is enough to keep going." Calvin was quiet for a moment, walking beside him. "What about the winter you lost the 2 trees?" Weston glanced at him. Not many people who had heard about the orchard knew about the 2 trees. "Who told you that?" "Your wife. She was talking to some of the women from the Leslie County group when we first arrived. She mentioned it." Weston said nothing for a step or two. "That winter," he said finally, "I sat in the truck on Route 9 for about 20 minutes. I didn't know what I was doing out there. I knew the 62 other trees still needed the work, but knowing what needs to be done and feeling ready to do it are 2 different things, and for about 20 minutes they were in different places." "What moved them back together?" Weston was quiet for a moment. "I went home and my wife asked me how many trees were left. Not whether I wanted to stop, just how many were left. And the answer was 62. And 62 trees still needed what they needed regardless of how I felt in the truck." He paused. That was enough. Calvin Reed drove home through 3 counties that afternoon with the windows down and the cool October air coming in. He stopped at a gas station on the edge of Cutter's Creek and sat in his truck for 20 minutes writing in a notebook he found in the glove box. He wrote everything he could remember, not the technical details, which he could reconstruct from the extension office handout, but the other thing, the way Weston held the first notebook. The way he paused before answering. What he had said about certainty and evidence. What he had said about his wife asking the right question. He wrote for a while after he ran out of specifics, writing towards something he didn't quite have language for yet. The sentence that stood out to him when he read it back, the one he had not planned to write, but had written anyway, was this: "The man lost 2 trees in 1990 and sat in his truck for 20 minutes and then drove home and kept going." Nobody saw that, but it happened, and it might be the most important part. That evening, Weston came home to find Nadine in the kitchen. She had made soup. She put a bowl on the table in front of his chair without being asked and sat across from him while he ate the way she had done most evenings for 46 years. "How many came?" she said. 43. "Did they ask good questions?" "Some of them." He spooned the soup. "One young man from Knox County, Reed, asked the right ones." Nadine looked up. "He said you told the women's group about the winter of 90, the 2 trees." She met his eyes across the table. She did not apologize for it. "It seemed relevant," she said simply. "They were asking about what it costs to stand behind someone when you can't see the outcome yet. I told them what it cost." Weston set his spoon down. He looked at his wife across the table, 73 years old, now the daughter of a tobacco farmer from Bell County, a woman who had learned to read the land through him and had applied that reading to him without ever letting him know she was doing it. 46 years, 3 children raised, 80 acres kept, 10 years of standing at a distance from a decision she had not fully believed in and not once pulling on the rope. "I didn't know you told people about that," he said. "You never asked." "No," he picked up his spoon again. "I didn't." They ate in silence for a while. Outside, the October evening was coming down over the fields, the light going copper and then gray over the hills east of the farm. "I want to show you something," Nadine said. She went to the kitchen drawer and came back with a notebook, small, soft-covered, the same kind he bought at the hardware store in town. She set it on the table beside his bowl. He looked at it. He recognized it. "You've had that since '89, he said. "Since the night you came home and told me about the $300. He did not reach for it immediately. He looked at her. "You don't have to read it," she said, "but I'd like to read you some of it, if that's all right." He nodded. She opened the notebook to the first page. The handwriting was hers, smaller than his, slanted slightly to the right. She read the first entry aloud. April 14th, 1989. Weston bought the marsh orchard today for $300. He says 10 years, maybe 12. I don't know if he's right, but I know him. She turned several pages. December 1990. He lost 2 trees tonight. He told me at the table and his face had something in it I haven't seen before. Not doubt exactly, more like the weight of distance, between knowing and arriving. I asked how many were left. He said 62. I didn't say anything else because he didn't need me to, but I didn't sleep until after 2. She paused. Weston was looking at the table. His hands were still. She turned to another page. May 1992. I went to the orchard this morning. I didn't tell him I was coming. I stood at the first row and looked at the new growth on the grafted trees, the color of it, the width of the leaves. I stood there for a while. Then he looked up and saw me. I asked if he needed anything. He said no, but thank you for coming. I drove home and wrote this. He was right. He was right, and I didn't know it for certain until today, and I never told him because he didn't need to hear it from me. He already knew, but I needed to write it down. She closed the notebook. She did not read the later entries. The yield figure she had tracked in her own hand, the names of the grocery accounts as they accumulated the 3-county notation from November 2000. Those were her accounting her private record, and she had shared what needed to be shared. Weston was quiet for a long moment. "You tracked the yields," he said, "every season since '94. Why?" She thought about this. "Because it was the work I could do from where I was standing. I couldn't be in the orchard. I couldn't fix what needed fixing or wait with you through what needed waiting. But I could pay attention. I could keep count." She looked at him. That was my part of it. Weston was quiet for a long time, long enough that the soup went cold in front of him, though neither of them remarked on it. 46 years, he said finally, and I'm still learning what you were doing while I thought I was working alone. Nadine's expression did not change dramatically. It was a small shift, the faint loosening of something that had been held carefully in place for a long time. Not release exactly. Recognition. "You were never working alone," she said. "You just couldn't see me from where the work was." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. He did not say anything more. There was nothing more that needed saying, and they had both lived long enough to know the difference between silence that is empty and silence that is full. Outside, Harlan County settled into its October evening. In the orchard on Route 9, the 64 trees stood in their rows in the dark, their roots deep in soil that had taken 11 years to become what it was now. Their branch structure clean and sound, the whole 4 acres resting through the night in the particular quiet of land that has been given back what was taken from it and knows it. In the spring, there would be new growth. There always was now. Weston drove out to the orchard the following Saturday morning, as he always did. He walked the rows with the third notebook in his jacket pocket and crouched at the end of the second row to press his fingers into the soil, dark and open. The faint warmth of biological activity moving through it even this late in the season. He stayed crouched there for a moment, the way he had stayed at every point of this work, not rushing toward the next thing, not measuring the present against the past, just attending to what was here. He stood and made his notes and walked back to the truck as the afternoon light dropped behind the ridge to the west. He had bought a dying orchard for $300, and a community had called him a fool, and he had simply gone to work. He had done the work that the land needed in the order that it needed it and at the pace that it demanded. He had done this for 11 years without asking anyone for permission or confirmation, and at the end of it, the land had produced what it was always capable of producing once someone was willing to listen to what it actually needed rather than what they wished it needed. And he had done it, it turned out, with a woman sitting at a kitchen table 46 years into a marriage, writing in a small notebook what she could see from where she stood, which was, in the end, everything that mattered. Some knowledge does not announce itself. It simply continues to be true while the world catches up. And sometimes the person standing beside you has known it all along.